I'm a big YouTuber.
I literally cover court cases for a living.
I'm trying to give you my ID.
I cover the court cases for a living.
Yeah, what's poppin', y'all? Welcome back to Crown TV Courts, brought to you by CrownTVNews.com. Y'all make sure y'all go check out the website. It is at the top of its category, an online newspaper and magazine. I'm super proud of the work we doing over there. So y'all make sure y'all go check out the website. Click the links in the description. Subscribe to all our other channels and follow me on the gram. If you are not following me on the gram, you're missing out on a lot. Crown TV Official. We also on Facebook at Crown TV News, and we on Twitter at The Real Prince, like it used to be on Instagram. Make sure y'all following us on all these platforms. If y'all not, y'all missing a whole lot. So this is bigger than YouTube. This is a movement. Let's get to the topic of the day. All right, now this is going to be a huge story in the very near future, maybe as early as this year. We're talking about Rayful Edmond III, and if you don't know who Rayful Edmond III is, you're talking about a major figure in D.C. in the mid to late 80s, somebody who was said to be earning upwards of $1 million a week at his prime, a kingpin turned cooperator. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're talking about the ugly truth of Rayful Edmond. When I say that, what I really want to get into is the full extent of Rayful Edmond's cooperation. So we're going to go through this in great detail. We're going to start with a little bit of backstory. All right, so we're going to touch on this document very briefly, and then we're going to get into another document that fully covers the extent of Rayful Edmond's cooperation. It says the defendant has been convicted in 2 separate cases, one in the District of Columbia in 1989 and 2 in the Middle District of Pennsylvania in 1996. The defendant pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate in the latter case. His cooperation in that case was successful, but the defendant assigned the benefit of his cooperation to his mother. It is the defendant's subsequent cooperation that is the basis for the government's motion to reduce the defendant's sentence in the former case. From approximately 1985 until 1989, the defendant was the leader of a large-scale cocaine trafficking conspiracy here in Washington, D.C. The conspiracy was responsible for distributing hundreds of kilograms of cocaine and generating millions of dollars in illicit proceeds. Members of the conspiracy used intimidation and violence to protect their business. All right, now I'm skipping forward a couple pages. It says the defendant's cooperation was successful. First, he testified in 2 cocaine trafficking trials in the Middle District of Pennsylvania. Second, the defendant was prepared to testify against 7 other defendants, but they pleaded guilty to narcotics trafficking offenses. Third, the defendant participated in a reverse undercover sting operation involving Washington area drug dealers who had been the recipients of cocaine shipped from Colombian sources at the defendant's behest. The sting resulted in the seizure of $190,000 in drug proceeds and convictions of 8 defendants. Last, the defendant provided information to law enforcement regarding 2 homicides that had been committed in USP Lewisburg in 1994, and he testified at the trial of one of the homicides. In his plea agreement, the defendant had agreed to designate his mother, Constance D. Perry, who was then serving a sentence for a conviction in the same criminal conspiracy for which the defendant had been convicted, as the beneficiary of his cooperation. In June 2nd, 1998, the government's departure motion was granted and Mrs. Perry's sentence of 293 months incarceration was reduced to time served. All right, so that was like a quick overview. As you heard, 2 cases. In the latter case, or the later case, that is the one where he cooperated and then gave the benefits of that cooperation to his mother, which then resulted in his mother her sentence being reduced to time served. Now we are going to get into the very minute details of Edmond's cooperation. All right, now this starts with a very interesting story, and this is where this is going to cause a split between people who just hate cooperators altogether and people who are citizen-minded and might find some sympathy with Rayful Edmond. So it says, Mr. Edmond provided substantial assistance to the government. Mr. Edmond's decision to cooperate was not based on a desire for personal gain. The court heard testimony from Stephen Benjamin, a former special agent in the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Agent Benjamin joined the FBI in 1976, but encountered Mr. Edmond for the first time at a small hotel on July 24th, 1990, when Mr. Edmond was removed from his placement at USP Lewisburg under ruse of a medical emergency for an unexpected visit with Agent Benjamin, Detective Rick Watkins, and Detective William Nealis. At the hearing, Agent Benjamin made it clear that this meeting was impromptu and a total surprise to Mr. Edmond. Agent Benjamin testified that Mr. Edmond had not been given any forewarning or heads up whatsoever regarding the hotel meeting that would take place or the subject matter that would be discussed during that meeting. The purpose of this meeting was for law enforcement to lay out its case to Mr. Edmond and present the evidence amassed against him as a result of a 2-year wiretap investigation of which Mr. Edmond was a target. The objective was to speak to Mr. Edmond about what his options might be, whether he liked to cooperate or not. The purpose of this meeting was to give Mr. Edmond an opportunity to cooperate. However, it was made very clear that Mr. Edmond was not offered any chance at assistance for his cooperation. In spite of that, he made the decision to cooperate anyway. Agent Benjamin's memory and recollection of detail was remarkably clear. His clarity in recalling events from over 20 years ago was likely the result of how admittedly impressed Agent Benjamin was with Mr. Edmond the very first time he met him in the hotel that day. Agent Benjamin used the word extraordinary at certain key junctures in his testimony that should not be ignored and cannot be understated. Agent Benjamin explained to this court over the course of his 14 years of working drug cases, he had worked with hundreds of cooperators. During this testimony, he professed that even in light of the vast number of cooperators that he had dealt with, Mr. Edmond was exceptional in every way. It says basically, he was all in no matter what we asked him to do. He was willing to do. While this description of Mr. Edmond's cooperation is important, the truly astonishing way that Agent Benjamin describes Mr. Edmond's demeanor when he arrived at the hotel on July 20th, 2014 is noteworthy to say the least. Agent Benjamin describes this encounter as one of his extraordinary moments in law enforcement and specifically describes Mr. Edmond's demeanor as extraordinarily calm. At the agent hearing, Williams and Mr. Edmond broke down and cried during the interaction at the Pennsylvania hotel. According to Agent Benjamin, he and the detectives present were stunned by what they witnessed that day. AUSA John Dominguez testified about Mr. Edmond's remarkable phrase, "What took you so long?" In addition to breaking down that day, Mr. Edmond told officers, "I didn't know how to get out of this," referring to the illegal drug trade. "I got started. I didn't know how to stop. I am ready to stop now. Maybe I can do good now." He testified about Mr. Edmond's remarkable phrase, "What took you so long?" On July 20th, 1994, Mr. Edmond had been looking for a way out of the drug business. Importantly, he made the decision on his own before there was ever a written agreement that he wanted to quit and that he would change his life and attempt to make amends for the devastation and destruction he left in the wake of his criminal conduct. All right, now this is why I say this may cause a split as far as opinions are concerned. Because on one hand, you have a guy who's a kingpin, who is a drug lord, who knows the consequences of his actions and is supposed to deal with them accordingly. And then on the other hand, if we listening to what the FBI and what the government is saying, is a guy who was fighting with his demons and cooperated without there being any promise of a benefit for himself, at least initially. So I'm curious to know what people think about that. Y'all can let me know what y'all think in the comments. Now we moving on to the next part. That was a story. The rest of this is going to be quick hits. So it says Mr. Edmond provided the government with assistance in obtaining wiretaps. It is undisputed that Mr. Edmond provided invaluable information that allowed the government to seek and obtain wiretaps in a large number of cases. These wiretaps led to an astounding 111 indictments and the conviction of 340 defendants. Now I'm skipping forward. It says the information that Mr. Edmond provided was very important and crucial information to those prosecutions. AUSA John Dominguez described that the government used Mr. Edmond as a compass. Indeed, according to Mr. Dominguez, Mr. Edmond was debriefed from Monday through Friday, beginning in August and ending around the Thanksgiving holiday. During these debriefings, Mr. Edmond provided information about crimes and criminal conduct and assisted in interpreting thousands and thousands of wiretaps. Mr. Edmond assisted the government by providing extensive trial testimony. Mr. Edmond's testimony at trial assisted the government in obtaining convictions and guilty pleas. After the hearing, the very compelling testimony describing Mr. Edmond's road to cooperation as told by Agent Benjamin, the court heard from former MPD officer Barbara Watkins. Officer Watkins testified that Mr. Edmonds gave information regarding 4 or 5 different cases. Most notably, Mr. Edmonds testified in the trial of Kevin Gray for about 4 days and gave extensive testimony that resulted in Mr. Gray's conviction. Y'all can find this on CrownTVNews.com. When asked to describe Mr. Edmonds' demeanor during the preparatory debriefing sessions, Officer Watkins described that it was kind of funny because we couldn't keep up with how fast he was giving us the information. So we were trying to write and he's steadily pouring out the information. So he was very upfront and informative. Mr. Edmond was also produced to testify as a witness for the government in a case in North Carolina. Mr. Edmond provided testimony by the Bureau of Prisons U.S. Marshals as a witness in that case to the assistant U.S. attorney, but the case ended up not going to trial and was resolved by plea. Not only did the information that Mr. Edmond provided produce potential trial testimony, but it produced other cooperators that led to more valuable information that led to additional arrests, prosecutions, and convictions. Finally, Mr. Dominguez testified that Mr. Edmond was willing to testify in the government's case against Bill Willis. This was a case that involved money laundering and drug trafficking. Mr. Edmonds' cooperation included informing the government about his past dealings with Mr. Willis and the operation of his business. Mr. Edmonds' testimony was not required in the case due to the fact that Bill Willis pled guilty. Mr. Edmonds provided assistance, which led to the resolution of 10 cold case homicides in Washington, D.C. It goes on to say Mr. Edmond assisted the government by identifying problems in the federal penitentiary telephone system. In addition to cooperation directed at specific criminal cases, Mr. Edmond provided invaluable information to the Office of the Inspector General and the Department of Justice about serious problems within the penitentiary system, which allowed criminal activity to persist within the penitentiary. The information that Mr. Edmond provided was a great force for change within the Bureau of Prisons, in that his information led to changes that prevented inmates from making three-way calls and restricted in individual inmates' calls to a limited amount of people on a pre-approved calling list. Mr. Edmond's cooperation was held in the highest regards by the government and law. When directly asked where Mr. Edmond's cooperation ranked on a scale of 1 to 10, AUSA Dominguez proclaimed that his cooperation was off the charts. Exceptional. Dominguez declared that nothing in his 35 years of being in AUSA compares to the level of cooperation given by Mr. Edmond. Now, that is the ugly truth about the level of cooperation that Rayful Edmond provided to the government. Y'all let me know what y'all think about this in the comments. Make sure y'all check out the website. Like, comment, subscribe. It's the Crown Prince. Peace, y'all.